name's Joe. I'm a crystal meth addict. How's everybody tonight? How come everybody's so excitable in here? This is step one night. Did you know that? That's powerless and unmanageable. We're not supposed to be so happy about it. How many of you have never been to a position of neutrality before? Anybody? Good. There is a bunch of you. Well, first of all, welcome. And second, let me warn you in advance, you're liable to perceive us a little different than other meetings of the fellowship you may have attended. Primary reason that's liable to happen is that we intend for you to have a different experience here. What we do here, we've been doing for a long time now, we take a look at the suggested instruction for a step or so a week, directly out of this book. And we use this book in Crystal Meth Anonymous. Why? Because it works. The process described by the authors of this book has been proven to work with addicts of the hopeless variety, addicts to alcohol and other substances. So what we do here, although we call it a study, is really a sharing. I'm going to show you how I find my experience in the book, and I'm going to encourage you to have your experience with the book. And if we both do our job, we're going to share a spiritual experience in this room tonight. How many of you have been here before and can witness for them it happens?
Absolutely.
So if you haven't been told and you're new to this, in 12-step recovery, when we talk about a spiritual experience, we're talking about a sensory experience. You will feel it. And when you do, I'll know, and I'll call it to your attention, because we teach you to talk to you about the power we call God without giving you a demonstration of the power. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you might want to know why my knowing that you're having an experience demonstrates the power of God. Well, we have to take one thing on faith. At every AA meeting I've been to, or most of them anyway, they read a little thing called How It Works, and they tell us there's one who has all power. That one is God. So if you're feeling it and I know, we're apparently sharing the same power.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so tonight we're in step one, and my expectation is we'll have some highs and lows. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, so without going any further into describing what's liable to happen, let's just see what happens. The first thing I want to show tonight to people in case, how many of you have heard this book called The Big Book Forever?
Yep.
So just for those people who have never had it shown to them, the real name of the book is Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. Why is that important, other than it's hard to say?
Because it's recovered.
Because this is a story of their experience. So whether we believe that they recovered or not hardly matters. They witnessed that this is the story of how they recovered and how they witnessed several thousand others recover. And whether or not anyone agrees with their experience, that's fine. They're all dead. There's no one to argue with. So all we're saying is that's what the book is. So it's important that we have someone help us find an experience with the book and not read it conceptually. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
The other thing is the reason we do the meeting the way we do this meeting is because this is their story and this is their experience. And Alcoholics Anonymous, the fellowship, was named after the book, not the other way around. And a lot of people have never been told that. They think this is a book written after the fellowship was formed. The fellowship was functioning as an off-group of the Oxford groups, and it didn't have a name. And then they wrote the book, they called it Alcoholics Anonymous, and then they struggled with what to call the fellowship. So we're showing you the program rather than the fellowship, because we're assuming you've all met the fellowship. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so then we're going to go from there to the forward to the first edition, and you'll see further why we do the meeting the way we do the meeting. The forward to the first edition tells us who the authors of this book are. Would that be useful?
Yes.
Given that they're, in a lot of halls we see steps on the wall, promises on the wall, things of that nature. Those are the ones that wrote it. So when they talk about the we, they're talking about them, not necessarily us.
Right.
And it's important to know that, because if we're not having the experience they had, it doesn't make theirs invalid. It probably means I haven't done what they suggest, and I probably haven't because no one's shown me what that was.
Right.
So our effort here is to show you what that was to the best of our ability. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right.
Okay, so they say we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of the book. So you notice they said to show other alcoholics, not to tell them.
Right.
So the entire book talks about a demonstration of power, how to recognize the power, how they improved consciousness of that power in them and through them, and then what they did with that awareness once they awakened to it. Does that make sense to you?
Right.
Okay, so the meeting has done that. That's what I'm going to do, is try and show you precisely how I've recovered. and then share an experience with you, right? Okay, so I'm going to go from there over to, I think where I want to go is the doctor's opinion, but I want to start a little earlier in the book than I have other times and start right at the page, the doctor's opinion. And now that we know who we is, who's we? The first 100 men and women who have recovered. They're the storytellers in this book. And it says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the reader will be interested in the medical estimate of the plan of recovery described in this book. You got to think about it in the time of the writing. There was no medical estimate other than that which they provided because addiction and alcoholism was not a disease at that time. So would you be interested if you, most of us get here and we know it's been called a disease, but we don't believe we're sick. Right? So really doesn't matter what the medical community calls it because the world as large hasn't really embraced it. So are you interested in the medical estimate of the program of recovery described in the book?
Yep.
Okay. It says, convincing testimony must surely come from medical men who have had experience with the sufferings of our members and have witnessed our return to health. So all they're going to, they're not alcoholics, the doctor's opinion, and the treatment of people that fed into this simply were people who had seen the hopeless alcoholics, the addicts. They saw morphine addicts, they saw cocaine addicts, they saw alcoholics coming back from World War I largely, and they're witnessing to the state they found them in, the introduction to the power as revealed through this process, and then what happened to them, and that's their description. Does that make sense? Okay? So when the doctor talks about certain things, it's an observation rather than an experience. When the authors talk about it, it's an experience rather than an observation. Does that help?
Yes.
Because you've got to know that, or you still buy into the argument of whether we recover or we're always recovering. Have you ever heard that we're always recovering here? Well, that's not what the authors say.
No.
So they're talking about a very different experience than the doctors are talking about, aren't they? And it's not an argument. Okay. All right, so well-known doctor, chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. To whom it may concern, I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. In late 1934, I attended a patient who, though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I had come to regard as hopeless. If the leading physician in the country, perhaps in the world, regards your condition as hopeless, what do you imagine your estimate is?
Screwed.
In the course of his third treatment, he acquired certain attitudes concerning a possible means of recovery. How many of you have had more than one go at this? Does it give you hope, even though sometimes in the fellowship we get less than welcomed back, that the author of this book was in his third treatment when he finally got introduced to power sufficient to overcome alcoholism?
Yep.
So apparently there is a learning curve for some. Is that all right? Okay. As part of his rehabilitation, he commenced to present his conceptions to other alcoholics, impressing upon them that they must do likewise with still others. And this has become the basis of a rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. This man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. So the doctor's introducing us to this fellowship of people, and he's now allowing them to come back into his facility and talk to others. So he has that much confidence. That's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go right from there over to the next page. And now we've heard a little bit of what Dr. Silkworth said. Now we're going to look at the authors and their view of what the doctor says, and then we're going to look a little more in depth into the authors. Then we're going to take a look at Bill's experience and see if we can't catch up with him. Does that make sense for you as a path? Okay, so on page XXVI it says, the physician who at our request gave us this letter has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement, he confirms what we have suffered alcoholic torture must believe. Huh. You think that sounds important, the emphasis they put?
Yeah.
That the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. How many of you have a hard time with that or just overlook that? It's really easy because there's an argument within the fellowship between nature and nurture and how do we get into it and do I drink myself into it. I'm either alcoholic or I'm not. When I put it in my body, I have an abnormal reaction to that chemical. So the doctor looking at that goes, oh, that's weird. Joe appears to be energized by alcohol. Yet alcohol is a sedative. My, that's an abnormal reaction. It seems to be some kind of allergic reaction. Anyone else here a drinker?
Yeah.
Have you found yourself to be energized by the substance alcohol?
Yes.
Does it start to make sense to you now why we've been joking about having an allergy all these years and no one understood it? Because a doctor describes my reaction to alcohol as an allergic reaction because it's the only medical term appropriate for an abnormal reaction to a substance.
Right.
My abnormal reaction is a sedative energizes me. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. So that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. Now, I also have a mental component. We focused greatly on the mental component through the fellowship, but we completely lose the physical component. Okay? All right, so it did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted to life, that we were in full flight from reality or were outright mental defectives. Did it satisfy you to be told that? No. In fact, you agreed with that, right? How many of you thought you were that and almost embraced the idea? If you took it out far enough, you needed to embrace the idea, right? Okay. So that they talk about that experience. These things were true to some extent, in fact, to a considerable extent with some of us, but we're sure that our bodies were sickened as well. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out this physical factor is incomplete. Now they're going to talk about this doctor's theory. The doctor's theory that we have an allergy to alcohol interests us. Are you interested now that you understand how he came by that theory?
Yep.
If we don't get explained that, then we're not interested at all. We just go back, yeah, I drink, I break out in handcuffs. But it means fucking nothing, and that's the thing I must believe. Right? Okay. So as laymen, our opinion as to its soundness may of course mean little. Right? I'm not a doctor. I can give a shit what the doctor's opinion is. But when I know it affects me, I pay attention. But as ex-problem drinkers, we can say that this explanation makes good sense. Does it now make good sense to you based on the explanation you just received?
Yes.
It explains many things for which we cannot otherwise account. So how many of you were, look, I know this drinking thing's not going to work out, so I'm only spending 10. Or whatever. So now it starts to make sense, right? I have this allergic reaction. It doesn't matter how many tricks I play on me. Alcohol's going to win. Maybe not today, but eventually. Okay? Okay, so then I'm going to jump over to the bottom of the next page so that we can get romping. So now we're in the expanded text of the doctor, and it says, of course, an alcoholic ought to be freed from his physical craving for liquor. What the doctor witnessed was that once we put alcohol in our body, we seemed that we had to have more. Not that we wanted more, we had to have more. And if to him, he didn't realize how it felt internally, he could just see the external. Does it make sense to you now?
Yeah.
Okay. And so this often requires a definite hospital procedure before psychological measures can be a maximum benefit. How many of you can guess what the hospital procedure is?
Detox.
Any of you been to a detox?
It was fun.
How many of you decided, since it was just a problem of will, you're just going to quit on your own? And so there you were out on the street trying to quit on your own, and you got sicker and sicker and sicker. And you either ended up in the hospital or back doing it again. Anybody else? So they've known for a long time detox is a good place to come get normalized, and then we can start showing you something that present to you so you can consciously decide whether you want to accept this solution or not, which is really a process to introduce you to a solution you already have within you. Okay? All right, so we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. That the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. So how many in a never?
0.
So have you ever put alcohol or whatever substance in your body and then found that you could not control the amount you took?
Yes.
That never happens to the average temperate drinker. So we can take the temperate drinker out of our vocabulary. Now we don't know whether we still don't know if we're alcoholic, but we do know that we're not moderate. Does that help? Okay.
That's a gross understatement.
These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. And once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, has that happened for you?
Yep.
Have you formed a habit that although it's not benefiting you much anymore, you find that you can't quit returning to it?
Yes.
Okay? Once having lost their self-confidence, how many of you have gotten to the point where you're trying to keep people to have people help you stay away from it, or you're coming to fellowships like this, left to your own devices, you're afraid it wouldn't work out well?
Yep.
Their reliance upon things human. Have you ever noticed that? How many of you were not going to pick up no matter what? And you had great resolve, and then you went out that day and thought perhaps you'd overreacted. Their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. Has that happened for you?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to jump from there over to one more promise in here, the other thing they say, and then I'm going to go into Bill's story. I'm going to go to page 24 of the book. And it's a promise they should have hung on the wall of every fellowship hall I've ever been in, I think. And I don't know why we don't, other than we don't want to be Debbie Downer. But the reason that alcoholism, if it was just an abnormal reaction, if I knew every time I ate a peanut that I was going to swell up, not be able to breathe, or go out and crash the car, or whatever the hell's going to happen, I would probably be able to detox from peanuts, okay. But my problem is with alcohol is even though I know that outcome, I can't stop from going back to that spiritual release I got at once by taking a few drinks. So what the authors tell us is what we need to understand if we are alcoholic, and you're the only one who knows. Page 24, it's all in italics. It says, the fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, so what are they trying to explain it? No. They're just saying most alcoholics, them and the thousands they've witnessed, right? We don't know why, but this is what happens, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. How many of you have been taught that once you're not drinking, then you have to choose? I've heard that nonsense in the fellowship. You cannot make a choice with an unsound mind. So if you've lost the power to choice, have you ever lost your cell phone in the ocean? Yes. Did you get it back? You might replace it, but you've lost that cell phone. So when they talk about we've lost the power to choose, we might get a replacement power, but it will not be that power.
Yep.
Does that make sense? Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We were without defense against the first drink. Hence the admission of powerlessness. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you notice how they separate the idea of consciousness from memory? So in the fellowship for years we told people to just play the tapes, think it through, remember your last drunk. If you can't remember your last drunk, you haven't had it yet. You ever hear that? Well, I can remember the last one and the one before that and the one before that, and I'm still fucked up. Now what? Because the authors knew what we're not teaching in the fellowship. It's not their fault they haven't been shown. Consciousness is different from memory. I have a process that improves consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look at Bill's story. Because we always learn better from stories. It's the nature of, you know, show me, don't tell me kind of thing, right? So we're at page 5 of Bill's story. And he starts out talking about that crossing over that all of us can remember and where none of us are too fond of. It says, liquor ceased to be a luxury, it became a necessity. Do you remember, consciously or unconsciously, the point in your life where you were no longer using because you wanted to, you were using because you had to? Okay? Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, often 3 got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I'd pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by a half-dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation. Now, we all laugh about that, but he's describing what it looks like and then what he thinks. You see, what he was like. Can you relate to him?
Yeah.
I'm drinking all night, and then I wake up sick and have to drink to get well, but I got this shit. Better living through chemistry.
Yes.
Okay. See, the whole point is that you're getting to hear his story. What I was like, what happened, what I'm like now. And none of it makes any sense if we can't get on board with him in the experience. Yes? Okay. So then he said there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Gradually, things got worse. How many of you noticed that? The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point of 1932, and I'd somehow formed a group to buy. Before then, oh, wait a minute. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. How many of you have had that experience? Sobered up for a minute, put a few things together, went out to celebrate the things you had together? So then he goes on to say that I woke up, this had to be stopped. How many of you had that happen? I saw that I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Before then I had written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. How many of you had somebody with you on the ride, some significant other or family members, and you'd convince them, and then they were convinced, and then you were happy that they were convinced, and then strangely something still went awry? Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Do you remember that? Do you remember when everyone knew, including you, that it wasn't safe for you to go out and drink or use again, and then you came home loaded, and they go, why'd you do that? And you're like, shit, I don't know. Do you remember that experience? Where had been my high resolve? So that's what he's describing. He knew that it was bad for him. He really meant it when he told her. He was happy that she knew he meant it. And then he's high, and he's like, I got nothing. Right? I got nothing. Okay, so I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way, and I had taken it. Was I crazy? Do you remember that introspection? What did you conclude?
That was crazy.
Can't sort that out now. Might as well get good and drunk, right? Okay. I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. So Bill starts to talk about the insanity that we're talking about in 1, as far as his experience was, is he had an appalling lack of perspective when it came to the rest of his life and the role drinking played in it. The alcoholic insanity, according to Bill, is an appalling lack of perspective. Does that make sense? By his words. Okay, so renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. What's that look like?
I got this.
Any of you get a little time under your belt, 30 days, 60 days? Got it. Right. What happens to us is if we don't start growing fairly soon, and that's no one's fault, you get introduced to power and you grow at the rate you're supposed to grow, but it helps if someone's shown us this. But what happens is that the illusion of control takes over our experience of grace. I drank every day no matter what, and then I didn't, and then I got this little reprieve. I did nothing with that reprieve, and then the grace I was experiencing dissipated. I started buying into the control illusion, and off I went again. And whether it's weeks, months, years, that's what happens. That make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time at all, I was beating on the bar asking myself how it had happened. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then, and I did. How many of you have had that experience? How many of you thought that you decided after you took the first drink to take the next one? See, that's one of the cunning, baffling, powerful features of addiction for us is once I put it in my body, it's done. There's no decision to have another. I suggest you get up on the roof, jump, halfway down and say, I've decided to hit the ground. It may make you feel better, but it has no potential to change the outcome. You understand? But that's the illusion of control, and if we keep feeding people control, we're here to overcome a control addiction, not a chemical addiction. And if we keep feeding them with the idea that somehow you get to decide, you've missed the promise. I've lost the power of choice. Not misplaced it. Okay, so then he starts to talk about the experience of waking up after that. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. So take a moment to that place. How many of you had some time in recovery, did whatever you did again, and then had to wake up to the reality that you did it again? Can you bring to consciousness now that remorse, horror, and hopelessness? It's gripping, isn't it? How many of you have not done that, but have had those dreams and woke up trying to come up with excuses how to cover up what didn't happen, but it felt so real?
Yep.
So you also know the remorse, horror, and hope. See, that's a shared experience that only an addict knows. Okay, so the courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dare cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell. Again, well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. Can you go with him on that ride? Did any of you take your addiction out far enough that you finally concluded that if you never tried again, you couldn't fail again? Go ahead, some of you went there. We don't necessarily have an understanding of that's what happens, but that's when people would say, well, what are you doing, man? Don't you know you're dying? Yeah, tell me when. Give me something useful. Okay. It's not bravado, it's utter hopelessness. You understand the difference? It may look that way, but when we're really in it, how many of you desperately wanted to do something else and knew there was no fucking way you were doing anything else? Okay. So then it says, that was a hard thought. That's why we wanted to go there. Powerlessness and unmanageability. Should I kill myself? How many of you have had those thoughts? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that. So 2 bottles in oblivion. See, the one thing about alcoholics, addicts of any stripe, is that we can induce our own spiritual experience. Why do you think they call alcohol spirits? And then we just imbibe, and no matter how miserable we are, we can forget about how miserable we are, and we can start thinking about how I'm going to get hooked up again in a minute when I've used this up. I'll have a new purpose, right? Okay. So the mind and body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony for 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again, I swayed dizzily before an open window of the medicine cabinet where there was poison, curing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape, and then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window sash and all. Guys, if you're not drinkers, who are my drinkers here? Did you drink to delirium tremens? Those of you who do know what he's talking about there. If you never drank to delirium tremens, it's when you're trying to detox away from a medical situation. And what happens is it's detox from alcohol. We're super saturated, and we start having hallucinations, very powerful ones. And it gets to be, we're seeing things that aren't there. We're doing harm to ourselves. I tried to cut my teeth out with a commando knife because I thought I was choking on strings. I mean, those are the kinds of things that happen. Yeah. So you can understand this experience. I'm not trying to impress anyone with, but you got to understand his experience there. Okay. And those of you that are meth addicts, 4-day run, you know. You've entered the world of the spirit. Okay. So the next day, this doctor shows up with a heavy sedative. That's good news for my heroin addicts, right? Sometimes they showed up with opiate, and sometimes they showed up with, benzos of some sort. How many of you got here and got treated as a Valium deficiency for your alcohol? That was good news. So Bill's experience his next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. How many of you found out that little trick about better living through chemistry? Little trick they don't tell us when we cross over from opiates, from alcohol, is while alcohol is easily replaced by opiates, opiates are not easily replaced by alcohol. The combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity. Any of you had that happening? People started to realize, man, there may be something to this sickness, because that is one sick mother. So did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. My brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I'd been seriously ill bodily and mentally. For Bill, the bodily component was the most important component. Because he had to have permission to let himself off the hook. Bill was one of those guys that felt like he drank himself into alcoholism, and so he saw it as a moral failing. And so once he found out that it wasn't a moral failing, that you're either alcoholic or you're not. If you drink and you're alcoholic, you're going to have an abnormal reaction. And when you do, you're going to drink more than you intend, even if you don't think so. Does that make sense? I've had people tell me, I don't think I've ever drank more than I intend. Well, I get that. We don't think we have. But the fact of the matter is we didn't mean to drink the mortgage away. Okay. So it relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics, the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor. See what he's talking about now? Though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. What's that little metaphor mean?
He was on top of the world.
He had it. That was it. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. So how many of you have been to more than one little treatment along the way? And got lots of self-knowledge? And then later on, maybe that wasn't quite enough? Okay. But it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time, I returned to the hospital. Have you guys ever noticed that? That when you start again after being stopped for a while, there's often gets bad quick? Here, do the visual of, on a ski jump, you're skiing and you're touching the ground, and then you're not. And the bottom's way the fuck down there. And I'm going to it. Get what he's saying?
Yeah.
Were you surprised to find that out? Now that you're aloft.
Yeah.
I used to have people say, if you haven't hit the bottom, quit digging. I'm like, well, you silly son of a bitch, if I'd have known I was going here, I didn't even think to grab a shovel. I've been in free fall. Anyone know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. They did not need to tell me, I knew. And almost welcomed the idea. Now do you see him describing his hopelessness? Do you ever get to that where they gave you the medical diagnosis and you just really didn't care? I don't know that we really knew, but we knew as much intellectually as we wanted to know. this shit isn't changing, right? How many of you can remember sitting in detox plotting your next line, your next hit trip to wherever? It was a devastating blow to my pride. How many of you had that going on?
Yeah.
Couldn't talk to anyone about what you were thinking and feeling because it just was so demeaning.
Right.
That's part of that powerlessness and unmanageability we got to get in touch with, and we got to be sensitive to people that have it. Just because people are saying, I'm fine, doesn't mean they're fine. Feel them, don't hear them,
Right.
if you're trying to help them. Okay? I, who had thought so well of myself, my abilities, and my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of thoughts who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. So now, go to that place where you're starting to realize the damage you've inflicted on your life and others, and now you're starting to use that as a justification for carrying on. Can you feel what he's talking about? You notice how no real words adequate to feel how hopeless that feels come to mind. So you don't want to come out of the first step experience and not have had some shitty experiences, because the experience of powerlessness is not a theory. Okay, so quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me a bit. Have you ever been sobered by fear?
Yep.
How long did that last for you? The beauty of being sobered by fear is that after a while we detox, and then we realize that the other way we used to overcome fear was drink.
Yep.
And we forget about all the other, right? Because we can't bring to consciousness with sufficient force. You see why the promise is so important. If you're alcoholic, if you're not alcoholic, carry on. Right? Okay. Then came the insidious insanity of the first drink, and on Armistice Day 1934 I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I'd have to be shut up somewhere or I would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was to be the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. Now, I'm not going to get off in that. We do sometimes. But let's talk about his experience that he describes. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. So clearly he's talking about this manner of living described in this book, isn't he?
Yep.
And he's talking about the sensory nature of this power we come to believe in, which is the subject of our experience, not the object of our belief. Does that make sense? Because next week we're going to look in depth at the second step experience, right? So how does one know power, peace, happiness?
Feel it.
You got to feel it. It's the only way you know it, right? Okay. So near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. Any of you sat drinking in your kitchen in November? Or whenever? With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. You ever had enough hookup that you were safe for 24 hours or more? Yeah. Isn't that a comforting feeling? My wife was at work. Look at the scene he's setting. I got plenty. I got enough to get through the night. Wife's away. And then he's thinking, I wonder whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. Any of you drinkers in here?
Oh, yeah.
You guys remember having concern of where to hide it? If you guys weren't drinkers, drinkers are hiders. Okay. I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. It's so important. They put that in italics. Why would they put that little note in italics?
Because it's important.
Because Ebby can't be sober. How many of you took your addiction out pretty far, but no matter how far you took it, you managed to have one friend who was just a little worse than you? At least I'm not that bad yet. That's who Ebby is for Bill. So it's important because here's the cat that can't be sober. This isn't just anyone he meets in the hall. this son of a bitch cannot be sober. But he was. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he'd been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. Dude has flown the coop and found a chemical, right? Of course he'd have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him, unmindful of his welfare. I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. So Bill's drinking himself to death, and everybody knows it. He's been through 2 hospitalizations. He's somehow got enough booze hidden in the house that he's going to drink freely the rest of the night. The wife's out, so he's not going to get nagged at. And an old drinking buddy's by, and don't worry about his sobriety. It won't be here long. Got the stage now? Okay, so the door opened, and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. So first thing that happens is he sees the guy who can't be sober, and he is different than he should be. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? So it was so profound that Bill's automatically taken aback by what walked through the door. I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed, but curious. Do you know what it is to be disappointed but curious? Like, I don't ever trust a non-drinker, but more for me. Tell me, right? I mean, okay, he'll get on board sooner or later. Do you understand what he's talking about? I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smilingly. He said, I've got religion. Well, now that would be a real buzzkill for most of us. I mean, even if we're religious and we heard that when we're drunk and drinking, that would suck. I didn't know you were coming, right? But what's profound is the guy who can't be sober says this word religion, freaks Bill out. So Bill has an expectation of what's coming next, but watch what happens next. I was aghast, so that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire all right, but bless his heart. Anyone from the South here?
Oh, yeah.
That's what you say when you're about to ignore him or diss him. Bless his heart. Okay, bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching.
Right.
So now he's told you what he's thinking. That guy's just invoked the word. Even though the profound experience of him coming in was off-putting, awakening to him, the minute he heard the word religion, everything went up. Okay. But he did know ranting. So now he told him what had happened, but he didn't act like what Bill thought would happen.
Right.
In a matter-of-fact way, he told how 2 men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They'd told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. Guys, we got to quit lying to people and not tell them what the truth is. We have a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. Right. Don't be afraid of the word. That's what happens. That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. So the guy that can't be sober is sober, and Bill is starting to realize that there is something to this experience, and now he's listening. He had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. I was shocked, but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. So get the message there. He came to pass his experience along to him. Not his opinion or his meeting list or a new book to read. There was no book to read. There was no meeting to go to. He simply came to share the story of what this power had done for him in a matter-of-fact way. Do you understand now why we do the steps? I do an inventory to see what I was like, what happened, what I'm like now, so that I can bear witness to the next guy. I'm going to have to go fast because I've played a little too long. I'm going to jump over to page 12, first paragraph. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me vestiges of my old prejudice. the word God still aroused a certain antipathy. So he's gone now from it bothering him to not caring. I can listen to it, but I'm not going to pay attention to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the word God is what's troubling, which is why we have a step 2 that introduces us not to God, but to power. Do you understand what we're saying? We introduce you to power, let the power do the teaching. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. So now they started telling me about the nature of this power, and I've just come from an experience where the whole world seemed united against me. And so that pissed him off. I didn't like the idea. How many of you didn't like the idea? I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of the Tsar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I've since talked to scores of men who felt the same way. My friend suggested that what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception? Now, we've taken that to extremes and said, you guys just write down what and have us out creating the creator. That's not what they said to do. So just get anything in your mind. We're going to introduce you to power. Can you bring to consciousness sitting here right now that sense of ease and comfort that comes at once by taking a few hits or a few drinks?
Yes.
If I told you once we introduced you to the power, not only would you experience that, but you could improve upon that so you could walk around spiritually inebriated, would it be interesting to you?
Yes.
Well, that's what we do through the rest of the steps. We never ask you to be abstinent in the program of recovery. We ask you to improve your consciousness so that you can walk around in a state of spiritual inebriation some percentage of the time. And if you come back next week, we're going to show you that. But I'm going to jump over to, I want to go over to page 30 of the book, because we're going to just end on that note so you understand what they're talking about. Remember in the rooms where it says the first step in recovery, what's the first step in recovery? To most of us, because we walked in the rooms of AA, what do we say?
See to our innermost selves and we were alcoholics.
No, but what's on the walls? We admitted we were powerless in our lives. So that is the instruction. And then on page 30, they give us the experience. And it's so important that we introduce people that might need the program in addition to the fellowship. They understand how the book's laid out. So on page 30, in the second paragraph, it says, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. How many of you thought that was some event based on what you heard somebody say? That was an event that happened way over there somewhere. Yeah. I've heard people 10 years sober say, well, back when I fully conceded to my innermost self. It's a constant awakening, a constant evolution of consciousness. We learned that we have to go back inward for power anytime we think the world's causing how we think and feel. So the reason we adopt this manner of living is that every time I think you cause the way I'm thinking or feeling, I'm back in a powerlessness experience. Because if you're causing it, I'm fucked. Because the only way it can change is when my perspective changes. Does that make sense?
Yep.
We'll leave you with that. Next week we'll find power. Thanks.